Most of the time, what we do is we kind of click on double speed and we get through the genealogy and then we get right to the good stuff, the birth of Jesus Christ, right? We just kind of tap double speed and we go through this section. And while the birth of Jesus is an important part of the story, as any birth is, you can't have a birth story without a birth. The genealogy of Jesus is also part of the story. In fact, it's a vital part of the story. Jesus' birth is actually not the beginning. Jesus' birth is, you would say, the last third, the beginning of the end of the story. Jesus' birth is the climax of history. When Jesus comes, as Matthew is going to show us, when Jesus comes, God is just about done wrapping up his story of redemption that started all the way back in the beginnings in Genesis with Adam. And when we look at all of history, in fact, the arrival of Jesus Christ is how God is going to rescue his people. It is the redemptive story of God. And it is one that we look to time in and time out again and again to gain encouragement about the things that Matthew wants us to see in this gospel, his good news, but also in the beginning of just this short section of a genealogy that Matthew has laid out for us. A few years ago, many of our attention was towards our ancestry. If you remember Ancestry.com, does anybody remember that website where we were all eager to find out our roots because it was so easy? You spit in a vial or lick something and then you send it in. And from your DNA, they were able to trace kind of where you were from. My boys had to do, two of my boys had to do projects where in elementary school, they traced their lineage. And my sister, who has been doing this for a long time, she has traced out our ancestry all the way back to at least as far as they can tell. Now, a name like Hudzina is not at all that common. If you meet a Hudzina, chances are I'm related to them. It's not common in Delaware or Chester County, and I'll often run into people who will know my brother, Christian, because he was involved in a ministry in the area, and so he got to meet a ton of people, and they're like, "Are you Christian Hudzina's brother?" And I will say, "He's my brother. I'm the oldest one." He's the youngest one. I'm the oldest one. Yes, he's my brother. It's a short conversation because there's not many Hudzinas. Hudzina is not a common last name. If you travel to the Czech Republic or Scranton, PA, you'll see a lot of Hudzinas, but not around here. Now, having the ability to trace your family lineage is not really all that important to us these days. It's not necessary during these modern times, except for maybe to your grandfather, so you could prove, maybe inheritance, or you could prove, your family line that is beneficial to you. But further beyond that, it's not necessary these days. But to a Jewish listener, to a Jewish reader, lineage in the first century is everything. It's everything. It traces you back to the people that were exiled, as we'll see in just a moment. It traces you to a particular family. It's how you figured out marriages. It's how you figured out what clan you were from. Lineage was everything to the Jewish listener. And in reading the genealogy of Jesus Christ, not only is it fun to hear someone like me wrestle through the names, it's always fun to listen to people. Hey, you want to have some Christmas fun? Get your aunt or uncle or your mom or dad to read through this list and just laugh at them as they mispronounce the names, right? That's just a little bit of Christian church fun, But in reading this, it's not just fun to hear someone struggle and pronounce the names that are archaic and not used these days, but it's also informative as to the purpose of Matthew's gospel. If you were to turn and go to the right and read Mark's gospel starts quickly right out of the gate, telling us in really 4 short verses. You can turn there later, but in just 4 short verses, he says that Jesus was written about in Isaiah, and that John came to baptize and prepare the way to Jesus. And then Mark just goes through the gospel. Mark is known for using the word immediately. He just gets right to the point and goes. And then if you go to Luke begins his gospel more like you would expect a narrative to begin. It's like, once upon a time. And he states out that others have undertaken to write a narrative, a history, and Luke says, "My friend Theophilus, I've written this narrative for you so that you might know that what you were taught, I've given you this orderly account so that you might know that what you've been told is true." It's certain. And so Luke begins his narrative, and he starts the gospel of Jesus Christ and then continues that gospel through the book of Acts, called Acts of the Apostles. John begins his gospel in eternity. He's like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He goes all the way back before creation. But Matthew, why does Matthew start with such a long list of names? Why does he start and begin with an account of Jesus' ancestors? Well, first thing, Matthew knew that the simple truth is you can't understand the story of Jesus without understanding his connection to the Old Testament. You can't read about Jesus' story and just start in the middle of time and have no context to why he came. You have to have a connection to the Old Testament. His connection to the whole story of God, the grand scheme of things, again, doesn't start with Jesus' birth. It started way before Jesus even arrived. And what we read in the New Testament is not disconnected from the Old. We don't just have like a new story. It's one story. The whole narrative from Genesis to Revelation is a story of a promised one to come. And Matthew points that out for us. Second, by tracing the lineage of Jesus, what Matthew is doing is he's proving the point that Jesus is the promised Christ. He is the anointed Messiah. He is the King that was promised. He's the one. And he proves the fact in a court of Jewish law by laying out the recorded ancestry of which the Jewish people cared very much about. By laying out a genealogy, what Matthew is doing is say, I want to point you to the line of David. And not only the line of David, I want you to see that he is from Abraham. And the reason why he traces this ancestry is because what a Jew would do is they would identify you by your ancestry. That was your heritage was your identity. Which leads us to the third reason why Matthew traces out the lineage, because in tracing the history of Jesus way back to Abraham, what Matthew is doing is he's proclaiming that in Jesus, all of the promises of God are fulfilled. He goes back to Abraham and says, you know the promise that was to Abraham? It's fulfilled in Christ. And so he lays out the gospel, the good news of how he proves that. God fulfills his promises, and Jesus is the proof of that point. And this is why Matthew starts with this lineage. He begins with Jesus. If you look at verse 1, it says, the account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. He starts with Jesus Christ, who is the son of David, who is the son of Abraham. And then he ends with Jesus Christ, and he says, this is the birth of Jesus Christ and how it came about in verse 18. He begins with Jesus Christ, and he ends his genealogy with Jesus Christ. And so what that is doing is that is saying that Jesus is central to what I'm about. Matthew's saying Jesus is central to the story. He's the main character. And in fact, he says he's the main character of all of this family line. Everything goes to Jesus. And so that's why in the first 18 verses, Matthew takes the time to write out a detailed genealogy. And notice, if you'll see in verse 17, it's he kind of he wraps it up neatly. You know, I'm the worst Christmas gift wrapper, and I don't mean not like rapper, like I wrap presents in a really bad way. And if you look at under the Christmas tree, you can tell which ones my wife has wrapped. They are neat and crisp and taped, and you can see the ones that I wrapped. It looks like I just wrapped it around there and just crunkled it up and taped it. There it is. What Matthew does is he neatly wraps up the history in 14 generations. He does 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. And the reason why he does it, he divides history up into 3 manageable chunks. Now, Jesus has a longer lineage than that, but what Matthew is doing is it's a clue, it's a narrative clue for you to know that this is an intentional line that Matthew selects so that he goes through and says that the fulfillment of the promises in each of these significant moments in Israel's history, from Abraham to David, from David to the exile, from the exile to Jesus, is to point you to the fact that this is intentional. This is about Jesus. So what is the story? What is the story? Well, we could spend a lot of time on each part of the story. We could go through and look at each of one of these characters in the line of Jesus, but we're not going to do that this morning. What I want you to do is I want you to see 3 major events. There are 3 markers in Israel's history. What Matthew does is he wraps up his lineage, but then if you lingered there, you would notice, okay, why does he take the time to put 14 generations. And you'll notice that there are unfolding events that happen from Abraham to Jesus that are important to the reader. You might say that God is fulfilling his promises through people. It's people and promises. And so let's look at the first promise. Go back to verse 2. Abraham fathered Isaac. Now, this promise goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. Let's turn there for a moment. If you have your Bibles, make a left-hand turn and go to Genesis 12. If you don't have a Bible, you could get up and get one, but I also have it up there on the screen. But I'm going to open it up. Genesis chapter 12. To give you some context, in the beginning, the first promise that God made was after the fact that people had gathered. God had created the world, he put people in it, and after the fall, after Adam and Eve decided to go their own way, we see the chaos that ensues. God has to hit the reset button with the flood. And by the time you get to Genesis 11, the people are gathering around themselves to worship themselves, to set up a kingdom for themselves. And so what God does is he scatters those people because that wasn't the purpose. The purpose wasn't for their glory, but for God's. But then out of that scattering, God decides that he is going to select one man out of all of those people who have just been scattered. These people want to make a great name for themselves, and so God scatters them across the globe, and then God selects Abram from out of all of these people, and he makes him a promise. He is to be the one through whom he would regather all the people back together. Chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And you, Abram, will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." That's promise number one. The promise that God makes is that all the peoples on earth will be blessed through him. Now, if you continued reading on the story, which we're not going to do, but if you took some time this afternoon and just kind of like skimmed through the story of God or took some time yourself to look it up, you would see that it doesn't go well for Abram's family. Abram's family is filled with, just folly, and there is a lot of turmoil and conflict. And you get to the part in the story where the descendants of Israel, Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, Jacob becomes Israel, and the people of Israel are enslaved in Egypt. They're not at all living up to their end of God's bargain after they're rescued out of Egypt. And you get to a point in history where you say, okay, well, the promise to Abram was that all of the people in all of the world would be blessed through the seed of Abraham. But you read the story, and it doesn't take you long to find out, like, man, this is not working out very well. God's second promise is to King David. We get to King David, and you go to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12. So if you're in Genesis, make a right-hand turn and go to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel is the history of the kingship of David. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 is the promise that God makes to David, who is the king of Israel. And he is a good king. And he's not without his failures, but he promises David in verse 12 that a son will come. The Lord says to David, when your time comes and you rest with your fathers, in other words, when you die, when your time comes, I will raise up after you your descendant, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. When someone says that they're going to establish the kingdom, that means, or establish anything, it means that it's going to remain firm. We're going to establish something, and it's going to stick. It's not going to be wishy-washy. And so the promise here is that not only will David have a descendant, but he will have a kingdom that is rock solid. It's established. It's not going to be overthrown. And so here is promise 2. Promise number 2 is Solomon. Solomon is the promised one to David, who is from his body, and he is the king, and he is a great king. He is an incredible king. In fact, the kingdom has never been better as it was when it was under Solomon. And Solomon is David's son, and as you read, he partially fulfills his promise. And so the first promise is that all of the people will be blessed in all of the world. that out of Abraham, someone will come. And then to David, he says, out of you, a son will come and his kingdom will be established. And so Solomon is the king and he establishes his kingdom. And so it's partially that promise. But then you read on and Solomon, in fact, dies. He dies. He doesn't live forever. And like every other king who is human, he dies and someone else takes his place. And his sons were unfaithful to God. And so God's promise to this son from David, the king, is also seen in Psalm 2. Make a right-hand turn and turn to Psalm 2. We see the promise in Psalm 2 where there's a promise to a king who seems to live forever. Psalm 2. In verse 6. I've installed my king on Zion. There it is. I've established my king. It's on Zion, my holy mountain. That's Jerusalem. And what will happen with this king? This king will have nations. I will make the nations, verse 8, your inheritance. There it is. There's that promise to Abraham. It's all of the nations. All of the world will be your inheritance. The ends of the earth will be your possession. We see it again in Psalm 72. If you make a right-hand turn and go to Psalm 72, verse 8, you'll see the pattern. There's this promise that's given. Psalm 72, verse 8. There's this promise of a king. May he rule from sea to sea and from the Euphrates to the ends of the earth. This promise. And so you read and you see this promise to Abraham and you read the storyline of the family and you're like, I don't know how this is going to work out. Who is this king? Who is the one that is going to come from the seed of Abraham, from the seed of David, to be the ruler who rules the ends of the earth and establishes a kingdom? Who is this king and when is he going to come? That's the question that the Jewish reader would ask. When is the king coming? It's constant. It's always on their lips. Under Roman rule, it's always, when is the king coming? When is the king? Is he the king? You'll see this in the narrative of the gospel. You'll see them always asking, are you the one? Is this the one? Who's the Messiah? How dare you say that you're the Messiah? They're waiting for a king because they've been promised for it for centuries. They're waiting for the offspring of Abraham, the offspring of David to come. Well, then you keep reading, and it doesn't get better. Matthew takes us to the exile. He says that at the time of the exile, these kings, and in that list, there's a long list of kings that were not very good kings. But the third promise that is given is not a positive outcome. It's what Matthew highlights is that there was a point in Israel's history where they did not hold their end of the contract. They did not hold their end of the deal with God. And so promise number 3 was that God said very clearly, if you do not obey the Lord your God, if your king does not obey me, then you will be afflicted. You will suffer. And so Matthew records the low point of Israel's history. He mentions the exile. He goes back to Abraham. He says, you remember Abraham and the promise to him? Jesus is from Abraham. Do you remember King David and the birth of Solomon, who we thought was the promised one, but it keeps going. Do you remember the exile when we disobeyed God? When we utterly disregarded the law of God, believing that he would do nothing? That's what happened. Israel did not believe that God would fulfill his promise in judgment on them. They went a long time, king after king after king, worshiping idols, sacrificing their children. They believed that God wasn't a man of his word, a God of his word. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, this promise that God gave to them, in verses 58 through 62, he's very clear about this. This is in the second giving of the law. Moses was very clear. If you're not careful to obey all the words of this law, which are written in the scroll so that you can go back to it time and time again, just in case you forget it, just open up the scroll and read it. It's right there for you to read. If you do not obey him by fearing this glorious and awe-inspiring name, the Lord your God, he will bring wondrous plagues. Verse 60, he will afflict you again and again with disease. Verse 61, the Lord will also afflict you with every sickness. Verse 62, and though you are numerous as the stars of the sky, that's a reference back to the promise of Abraham. Abraham, see these stars? Your descendants are going to be more than those. Though you get to that point, if you disobey me, God does not care that they've multiplied in his tomb. He says that the primary thing is that you would love me with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your strength. And if you fail to do that, then I am going to bring judgment against you. I'm going to afflict you. That's what affliction is. Affliction is is judgment, because what God wants us to do is he wants us to turn to him. That's the purpose for affliction. It was the purpose for Israel, and that's why they were exiled. And as a side note, this is the way that many of us in this room, some of us in this room live today. We don't believe that God is actually going to judge the world for sin. We live as if there's no judgment coming. There's no consequence to our sin. We live as if there is no law, there is no God, there is no righteousness, to which we're held to a standard of, and we just go about our lives thinking, it's okay. I'm going to expire at the end of my days, and I'm not going to have to pay for any of the unrighteous deeds that I've done, which is not true. Which you might say, man, that's a pretty dark message on the first week of Advent. But the issue is that unless you understand the bad news about that, the good news isn't very good news. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the good news of what Christ has done for us in light of the bad news, that judgment is to come for all unrighteousness. He's done it before, and he will do it again. Everything in the Old Testament points to a thing that will happen in the future, only greater. So when there's a promise of hope and of multiplication of a people and a king, the thing that happens in the future is greater than what happened in the past. And so when Jesus comes, he is the greater king, establishing a greater kingdom. When the exile happened for the Israelites and God brings them back, it is a picture, a shadow of what will happen in a greater sense for all nations in the future. They will be exiled from the presence of the king. And so we're to take heed and to take warning and to look at this genealogy. What Matthew is saying, my people, my friends, my kin, my kinfolk, my Jewish people. And in the future, he's saying, anybody that will listen, this is the line of Jesus who came to fulfill all that was promised. One of my favorite hymns is O Come, Emmanuel. Do you guys like that song? O come, Emmanuel. Every week I end up singing. I don't try that. It just, whatever. The hymn says, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. In Matthew's genealogy, what we see is Matthew making very clear who Jesus Christ is in terms of his ancestry, that he is the one who was related to Abraham. And Abraham's promise of the blessing for all nations is fulfilled in Jesus. He is the king that came that was promised to David. And he is the one who would atone for the sins of those who were guilty and exiled. But now God is seeking reconciliation with not just Israel, but for all people. And you'll see that in the Gospel of Matthew. You'll see that Matthew is very anti-selective people. He's saying that Israel, you're not the only ones. Jesus is very clear. He came for both the Jew and the Gentile, that it is for all the people of the world. Israel was being held captive, Matthew says, and they were in need of rescuing, and Jesus is the one who came to rescue them. And so the question is, how is God fulfilling his promise? After you read this genealogy, you think, how is God going to fulfill the promise to Abraham? How's he going to fulfill the promise to David? And how's he going to fulfill the promise to Israel? How's he going to bring all nations back together again? How's he going to bring us back to the garden? How's he going to reverse course? We are going away from him, but now how do we get back to him? That's why Jesus is at the center of history. There's a commercial, I think it's a Honda commercial or Toyota commercial where there are these people competing in motorcycles and race cars and off-roaders, and the narrative goes, this is the last time you will ever see me try to attain first place because you will forget me. And it goes in an order where you think, oh man, this is dreadful. This person's giving up. But then it's written in such a way that when you start to read it from the bottom back up, it's actually, they're not giving up, but they're going to make it back to, you're going to know their name. So it's a fascinating commercial. And in the same way, the gospel, it is a picture of, you think that the trajectory of the story of the world is going to go off a cliff when it gets to this point, and then Jesus arrives, and then you realize, oh, no, we're not going off a cliff. We actually can turn and go back to the garden. How is that going to happen? Well, the answer is Jesus. It can't get any simpler than that. The answer is Jesus. Do you want to know how God fulfilled the promises to Abraham? Matthew says it's Jesus. Do you want to know how God fulfills the promise to David? Matthew says the answer is Jesus, right? Pop quiz. How is God going to fulfill the reconciliation of all of Israel back to himself? The answer is, you guys are sharp. When you get to verse 17, Matthew's list summarizes these generations so that you, especially if you're Jewish, would see it very clear, and you would know three things. One, that we can trust God to be faithful to his promise. Matthew's saying he is faithful to his promise. He's faithful. And you're going to read about how he is faithful in the gospel. You're going to see how God, through his son, does miracle after miracle, but more importantly than the miracles, because miracles are temporary. All who were healed in the first century died. Miracles are temporary, but the word of the Lord lasts forever. And so what Jesus came to do is to proclaim the good news of reconciliation through himself so that your sin, so that death would be temporary, that death would not win, that death would in fact lose, and that Christ the King, who is exalted on high, will reconcile all who trust in him back to himself, and they will live forever and ever. And Matthew wants you to know that you can trust God to be faithful to his promises. He also wants you to know that God has been faithful and will continue to be faithful despite his people's unfaithfulness. You read through this list and you're like, man, if you go back, and Google some of the names in here, there's some shady characters. They're sus. You read like this is not the ancestry that you would lead with. You would not take this ancestry and be like, hey, you want to see how cool I am? Look at my ancestors. Like, I see a couple prostitutes, some adultery in there, some wicked kings. You're like, wait, don't look at that ancestor. He doesn't cover it up. He wants to point to the fact that God has been faithful despite the royal line's unfaithfulness. And Matthew wants us to see that God has been faithful. He's been faithful despite unfaithfulness, and God is unwavering in his commitment to move through history so that we would know who Christ is, to be revealed and to be exalted, that his king and his promises and his truths stand. That's what Matthew wants you to see. That's what the genealogy is for. If you're a Jewish listener and you're just starting to listen to this, you're sitting in the synagogue or you're sitting and you're listening to this for the first time and your ears are perked, you're like, okay, prove it. You've just lined this out for me. Prove me his faithfulness. Prove that he's the king. Prove that he is the fulfillment of Abraham. Prove that he's going to reconcile Israel back to himself. I'm not going to work through here, but just, for you to just think about, like, if you went later today and you did look up, a couple of the names that are listed in here. Tamar is one of them. In verse 3, Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Use your concordance in your Bible and look up the story of Tamar and be encouraged. It's a crazy incestuous story. It really is. You're like, that's in the Bible? And that's in the lineage of Jesus. Matthew says, yeah, let's put Tamar in there. Let's put Rahab in there. Rahab is the one who was verse 5. Rahab was... she was a prostitute when Israel came into the land, and she was self-serving. She's like, hey, tell you what, if I rat you out, if I let you into the gates and you defeat my people, will you save my family? And they're like, absolutely. Yeah. She shows trust in God. She's like, I'm defecting from my people because your God seems to be a bit stronger than ours. Is that good? And they're like, yeah, absolutely. Rahab the prostitute, used by God. Verse 5. Look it up. Ruth, who was the father of Jesse, Obed, who fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King. Ruth is in there, and she was an idol worshiper. She was a Moabite. She worshipped idols. She did not worship the Lord God until she married into the family, and she's like, I'm just going to go where you're going. Ruth, you could read her story. It's 4 chapters. Solomon, if you turn the page and look at Solomon, Solomon was He was born by Uriah's wife. David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. Basically, that was an adulterous affair in which, David murdered Uriah, and that's a story worth reading. In fact, all of these women would never have been, if it was up to a Jewish male, you would never include women, because women are not the line of ancestry. It's through the man. And that's why Matthew puts the women in there, is because he wants you to see that the Lord uses women, and in particularly one woman, where the seed comes through, and her name is Mary. Joseph is related to Jesus too. There's another lineage that you'll read in another gospel. Luke, he takes it all the way back to Adam, and Adam goes all the way through to Jesus, or to Joseph. But in Matthew's, he wants you to see that God used Mary. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, there's a few encouraging things about that. One, that, God uses the messiness of life. You look at the answer, we have crazy families. Can we agree? We just came out, some of us are still in recovery from Thanksgiving. We're like, some of us are not here, and that's because they're recovering from Thanksgiving. We have crazy family, but God uses the messiness of life. God uses our mess. He's not afraid of it. We have mess in our life. I'm messy, you're messy, everybody's got mess. But God does not fail to use it. I need to hear that. I need to be like, yeah, these people are jacked up, and yet God still uses it. God uses us as we are, not as we want to be. God doesn't wait till you're the ideal person. He meets you right where you're at. Isn't that good news? God's not waiting for any of these people because they were unfaithful. It would never happen. He does not wait until we're ideal, because it will never happen. God's timing is not our timing. He works in his own time. He took a long time to bring Jesus, and he takes a long time to bring us to where he wants us to be, but he's not waiting for us. He's working with us. He is meeting us right where we're at. And if you notice, Jesus comes from a long line of ethnically diverse and moral outcasts, which is why he came to be a friend. You'll see in the Gospel of Matthew that he came to be a friend of the ethnically diverse and the morally suspect. That's good news. That's the good news of the gospel. Isn't it good news? This is why we celebrate Christmas, because it is the beginning of the good news that is for us.